Animal Crossing New Horizons lets you escape to a world all your own.
Animal Crossing New Horizons gives us all the best reason to quarantine ourselves and start a new life on a faraway island.
I escape reality and dive face first into a land of serene animal friendships.
Into a truly meditative and relaxing escape from reality.
Animal Crossing New Horizons lets you escape to an island all your own.
Escape isn't a new label for games. The classic gamer caricature typically evades society and responsibility, hides in the digital refuge of some immersive life simulation like Animal Crossing, and sits as a glutton of media. But here's the thing, Animal Crossing isn't an escape from setbacks and obstacles, it's an exaggeration of them. Given its global success, it's worth asking, what is the core experience of Animal Crossing? It parades as a community-building simulation, but don't be fooled. The art style suggests childlike experimentation and carefree creativity. This happens eventually, but like everything in the game, you're going to have to work for it. The game is at least nominally about an island getaway, but the core loop is all about work. That's right. In the midst of a global pandemic, recession, and mass layoffs, what did we choose to occupy ourselves with? Work. And fake work, at that. Illusory debt, brain-dead manual labor, and tedious UI navigation. Fascinatingly, most of the reviews that flag Animal Crossing as an escape also recognize its repetition and boredom. Animal Crossing apparently doesn't want you to believe that. Like I said about the art style, it looks juvenile, chipper, playful, but after dozens of hours on the island, we start to question just how playful the game is. Let's stop and consider the meaning of the word play. For a mechanical engineer, play is any non-optimal movement in a machine. Any gap between the teeth of two gears is called play, and engineers are tasked with removing the play from the system, as it wastes energy. When we use the word play in contrast to work, we're using it like a mechanical engineer. Work is productive and optimized. Play is frivolous and chaotic. Culturally, we carry a definition of play deeply informed by Jean Piaget, whose study on cognitive development in the middle of the 20th century characterized play as exploratory, curious, and necessarily childish. In games, though, we encounter our most complicated relationship with the terms and the line gets blurred. We call interacting with a game play, but neurologically, brain scans of people playing games show activity more associated with work than Piaget's definition. Which means often when we talk about play in regard to games, especially games like Animal Crossing, we mean in some sense work. As an even better example, consider the indie farming game Stardew Valley. At the beginning of Stardew Valley, you are stuck in a gray cubicle working for some monolithic Walmart substitute called JojaMart, until a letter arrives from your late grandfather. Turns out he used to be in your position. He'd lost real connections to other people in nature, and his salvation was a farm in Stardew Valley. The game sees you fix up the farm and return the community back to its former glory. It has a lot in common with Animal Crossing. You plant, harvest, mine, fish, and forage for money and resources. Meanwhile, at the edge of town, a new JojaMart sits as a sort of silent capitalist enemy to your more organic efforts. As you play, though, you quickly realize the joy of the game comes from optimizing everything about your day. You are trained by the gameplay systems to see everything, time, money, soil, people, as a resource, as a means to an end. The irony is inescapable. Once you are gleefully earning somewhere above $1 million a year, it's hard to ignore the sense that Stardew Valley is a capitalism trainer. It's not clear what exactly was happening on your cubicle computer at the beginning of the game, but odds are it wasn't that different from what you were doing in Stardew Valley after the first couple years of farming. The game rewards streamlining and optimization above anything else. So, by both the earlier definition provided by engineering and the definition suggested by the gameplay systems themselves, you don't play in Stardew Valley. You work. Just to be clear, this is not a problem with Stardew Valley. Stardew Valley is fantastic. This is a semantic problem. The value of these games is betrayed by the play-centric language at our disposal when talking about these games. We use the word play when talking about games because games aren't conventionally productive in the way that work is. People who participate in games are called the players. Interaction with a game is called gameplay, etc. But traditional play, that is, aimless exploratory behavior, really only describes a small part of a game like Stardew Valley. One of my favorite board games is Power Grid, and in case you can't tell from the title, it's about as dry as game themes come. You buy power plants from an auction, grab resources to fuel those plants, and provide energy to a network of cities on a map. Whoever makes the most money from their power grid wins. It sounds like work, but unlike Stardew Valley or Animal Crossing, Power Grid takes no pains to distance itself from its capitalist inspirations. The board map shows the US riddled with the icon of industry, cold, gray pipe. All of the cities are reduced to installation prices. Compare this to other board games like Suburbia or Food Chain Magnate or most idle clicker games. All of these games are shamelessly capitalistic. But abstract the actual mechanical processes of these games, and the correlation between play and capitalism becomes even more apparent. Next to the domestic repetition of something like Animal Crossing, first-person shooters might seem immune to the work comparison. A first-person shooter like Call of Duty is loud and unpredictable. Players make decisions on the fly as they adapt to new threats on the battlefield. Surely we don't optimize a shooter, right? Wrong. This is Kovacs. It's an aim trainer used by players to improve their aim in first-person shooters. Consider the industrial aesthetic here. The environments are obviously simulated, as are the targets. The idea is that this simple, high-contrast environment removes the noise so that players can strengthen their hand-eye coordination. In effect, it means that they can take time away from the game to click on abstract shapes as fast as they can. A friend of mine who just got signed to an esports team for Apex Legends is expected to spend upwards of 2 hours a day in Kovacs. Kovacs clarifies the simple mechanical process of all noisy first-person shooters. At the end of the day, shooters essentially ask you to move your mouse to an on-screen coordinate as fast as possible. Seen through this lens, storming the beaches of Normandy and dispatching Nazis is not that different from the act of navigating a spreadsheet as efficiently as possible. In 1910, during a boom of factory production and industrialization, Frank and Lillian Gilbreth started what they termed motion studies, which shifted the engineering focus away from industrial machines like assembly lines to the people that worked on assembly lines. Lillian Gilbreth is the one responsible for things like the foot pedal trash cans and the shelves and refrigerator doors. The Gilbreths used cameras to track the specific motions of the human variables, fingers and joints and movements, in order to maximize the potential of human activity. Two things happened as a result. First, as you might expect, profits went up, as much as 30% for some businesses. The second is more surprising, at least it was for me. Workers reported being happier and more satisfied in their jobs. The lesson about humanity here is that these optimizations are deeply satisfying. There's an inherent pleasure not in play or avoiding work, but in working optimally. Games like Power Grid or Animal Crossing distill this pleasure into a consistent experience. Whether we sit down with a Sudoku or a difficult 50-hour RPG, we are setting our minds to the same sort of corporate work that often gets characterized as inhumane. Consider the games we've made and played in the last 30 years, and it's hard to ignore. The optimizing efforts of capitalism are the very things we seek out for recreation when the workday ends. So it's obvious that we don't trade the challenge of work for the leisure of games, but rather we trade one type of challenge for another. But the question remains, why? Some quick research on the question, why do we play games, returns dozens of answers. You may encounter a game designer talking about Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's research on flow, since flow articulates that challenge is necessary for profound engagement with a task. You may come across Nick Yee in Quantic Foundry's work on gamer motivation profiles, which describes 6 core motivations like mastery, achievement, or creativity. Maybe you'll find Ed Deci and Richard Ryan's work on self-determination theory and the core needs like competence every human has that games can supply. But these approaches underscore the more interesting question beyond why do we play games. When all the motivations and rewards proposed by these theories are also byproducts of work, why play games at all? Yes, neuroscience tells us that games stimulate the same part of the brain that work does, but why? When work has such obvious productive social and material outcomes, would humans devise false, non-productive procedures to busy themselves with? Why does Animal Crossing promise an escape when all it does is replace real-world work with a simulation of work? If we're already challenged outside of games, what exactly do games offer that the rest of the world doesn't? For the last 300 years or so, art has been subject to the exact same line of interrogation. For example, why make a non-functioning object and hang it on a gallery wall in a world dying of starvation and suffering from scarcity? Artists themselves framed the question in the 20th century by way of ready-mades. Ready-mades are essentially objects that the artist didn't craft, but instead repurposed as art and placed in a show. Sometimes this means they reconfigure everyday objects into something unexpected and new, like Duchamp's 1913 piece Bicycle Wheel. But the point is even clearer with something like Jeff Koons' 1979 exhibition, The New, where Koons didn't reconfigure as much as recontextualize. Here, Koons simply took vacuum cleaners and placed them in well-lit display cases. Where they once would have been functional objects, Koons repurposed them as preserved, pristine objects for consideration. No doubt these works transgress traditional categories of art, but in so doing they force us to reconsider our notions of usefulness and function. As Oscar Wilde wrote in his famous preface for The Picture of Dorian Gray, "We can forgive a man for making a useful thing as long as he does not admire it. The only excuse for making a useless thing is that one admires it intensely. All art is quite useless." And we can presume he meant useless in an industrial sense, in the same sense that we mean it here with reference to work and play. Ever since the earliest days of painting, when a painter had to harvest purple pigment from an actual flower to paint a picture of a purple flower, art has stripped real-world functionality and material worth from objects for the sake of freezing them for contemplation. Games do the same thing, but for processes instead of objects. Games take our processes and freeze them in a way. The real-world farmer plants seeds, raises livestock, and rotates their crops because they have to pay wages, produce food, and provide for a family. The farming game only asks that the player enjoy the process of farming, and in so doing creates a farming environment freeing the means of farming from the ends. In this way, farming, which is to say the process of farming, is captured for examination in a way that real-world work, so rigidly focused on outcomes, never really permits. Why do we have so many games fetishizing banal work tasks? Farming Simulator, Overcooked, Papers, Please, Shenzhen.io, we long to shift the focus away from the outcomes and onto the process itself. So, back to the earlier question, why, when work puts real food on real tables, would we spend time on useless challenges? It's because games are simply work, but work delightfully freed from the obligation to be productive. Animal Crossing is all about work, and that's exactly why it succeeds.
It is a game, isn't it, Mary Poppins?
Well, it depends on your point of view.